how do we think about user data in a way that respects the privacy of the user, respects the trust that the users are giving us, and how do we continue then to build fancier machine learning models, right? And I think as a result, there's a lot of research going into how can you train machine learning models with less data, right? Things like transfer learning, where how can you take a machine learning model that has been trained on some data and then give it a little more data for a particular use case.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to your favorite CX show, the Engati CX show. I'm your host, Rahul, and today we have another amazing technology expert with us. But before I introduce you to our guest, let me introduce you to the magic of Engati. Now, Engati is the world's leading multilingual no-code chatbot platform across 14 channels with 35,000 bots created across 186 countries in every domain and use case. Engati has also been recognized as the top platform by Inc.com, TechWorld, CIO, and many others. We run the Engati blog, the video channel, and the Engati CX podcast that you guys absolutely love, receiving upwards of 400,000 visitors annually. And now for our guest is none other than Tulsee Doshi. Tulsee is the product lead of Google's efforts in ML fairness and responsible AI, driving a deeper understanding of how we can build user experiences that are diverse, inclusive, and ethical. Her goal is to drive a human-centered approach to the development of machine learning-based technology and experiences so that we build systems that can truly work for everyone. She developed an expertise in product management for machine learning products with a particular focus on AI ethics in policy and product development. So welcome to the show, Tulsee. Such an honor to have you on board.
Thank you so much. I'm excited to be here.
Great. So before we dive into the interview, and remember to subscribe to our channel. So there's a red button that you see there. Yes, that button, click that. So you are up to date with the content and the images and the videos that we post. And, you know, and also click on the icon, the bell icon, so that you get exclusive access to all the content, and amazing thought leaders come on the show. Thought leaders like Tulsee, and they shed light about CX, machine learning, AI, all that cool stuff. So don't miss out on that, and just hit the bell icon and the subscribe button. So jumping into the first question I have for you, Tulsee, and you know, a lot of these ML generator models, right, like GPT-3, they rely on open source data sets from all over the world. But what really happens when an open sourced data set, you know, presents a bias?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, you know, as you mentioned, there's so many models that we are now training worldwide that are reliant on open source data. And part of that is because, you know, taking a step back, machine learning systems very much rely on data, right? And the more data that you have, the more often nuanced you are going to be able to build a model. But data is expensive, and collecting data is hard. And so often there's a huge reliance on open source data sets, right? Data that already exists out there. And the issue is that most of these open source data sets have been created in the West, and that they often have, therefore, a bias towards, you know, whoever has created the data set and where they've gotten that information from. Right. And so the big issue is if your data set, for example, only represents images of people in the United States, then your model is likely only going to learn to recognize people who are from the United States. Right? If you only have images, even within the United States, of, say, the upper middle class of the United States, your model is going to learn to recognize certain patterns or behaviors or habits that are associated with that community and that population. And the interesting thing I think that's important to call out is that there isn't just one category of bias. It's not just, you know, hey, what country did you get the data from? It's really, what does the data reflect? What are the underlying patterns, stereotypes, behaviors, systemic issues that data set represents? And so we've seen, actually, when we've, on the Google side, when we've, you know, trained models, that the data can very much be critical to how the model works for diverse user populations. And so, yeah, I'm happy to provide an example, but that's kind of the way I think about it.
But Tulsee, how do designers filter through these biases? Like, is there a way to minimize algorithmic biases?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think, you know, that's a hard question because I don't know that there is a one-size-fits-all solution to algorithmic bias, right? So I don't think there is such a thing of like, you know, hey, we see algorithmic bias, we're going to do this one thing and we're going to solve the problem. But I do think there are things you can do to mitigate the risk of bias, right? One thing you can do is just be more thoughtful in the data set collection, right? As we talked about, if we're being a little bit more careful about where we get the data, there's a huge need for continuing to build up that expertise, that knowledge, and to bring in the biggest way to mitigate algorithmic bias. Honestly, to just have more perspective in the room comes where pointing, because you're going to more likely proactively see concerns for different communities or opportunities for different communities if you're putting that in.
Yeah, that's true, because honestly, especially in times like, I mean the new era wherein there's not a lot of difference between who's American, who's Indian, because the internet has made the world smaller, and that has brought a lot of users on board too. So I think it is very important to consider that diversity when you're actually planning and things. But Tulsi, when you're talking about something like this, and now that builds up to my next question, and it is one of the most important questions of the time. So when we're talking about the ethics of AI, a concern that pops up, and it's a huge concern, is security. So what are your views on the data security and privacy standards that are being set up? And do you think that, it limits the access of data sets needed for, ML models?
So I think, yeah, I mean, at a high level, yes, right? I think if you are being more private and secure about the data that you are using and collecting, and you are making sure that you are only using the data, for example, for the purpose by which it was collected,
Right.
then you are inherently going to be limiting the scope of that data. I think, though, that is important, right? So I think that as much as we are limiting the scope, I think that actually it's the right thing to be doing, because I think that the risk of also using someone's data in ways that they aren't aware of, right? In terms of monetizing someone's personal information in a way that is not useful for them, or creating other conflicting incentives, I think is also a problem, right? And so I think this is actually one of the bigger challenges that we're going to be facing in the next few years, is how do we think about user data in a way that respects the privacy of the user, respects the trust that the users are giving us, and how do we continue then to build fancier machine learning models, right? And I think as a result, there's a lot of research going into how can you train machine learning models with less data, right? Things like transfer learning, where how can you take a machine learning model that has been trained on some data and then give it a little more data for a particular use case, so that it can learn for that use case, right? So I think we're trying to really push the frontiers of research to say, how can we make it so that we don't need tons of data to make an effective model? And how can we make sure that we're still doing that in a fair and ethical way, but that way we can preserve user privacy? And then I think the other place where there's a ton of research advancement, which is really exciting, is thinking about things like differential privacy and federated learning, right? Privacy approaches that allow you to protect user privacy and make sure that you're still learning the nuanced, appreciation for a particular user, but you're doing that, for example, on device.
Yeah, because it's one of the pressing questions that go on, and I think we've had on this show, we have had a number of conversations about this. And I think one thing that also pops up is that talking about the future, and this is a very interesting thing, because I think in the past 6 months, a lot of people have seen a technology boosting in. And it's been crazy, right? The technological growth has been crazy. So what emerging trends do you see in the near future? Do you see a shift from using narrow AI systems to general AI systems happening anytime soon?
It's a good question. Broad emerging trends. So I think GPT-3 is a great example. You brought that up earlier, of, I think, something that we're going to see more and more of, right? The ability to sort of create these large scale general models that can then be used for numerous use cases, and also using certain techniques be actually repurposed for particular use cases, right? So I do think that is one area. This sort of notion of large scale natural language models is one that I think is going to continue to grow and be an exciting space for progress. I think that other spaces that we're gonna see this continue to grow in other domains as well, right? Like whether that be in vision or speech and other places. I do think, though, as the conversation about AI ethics continues to grow, like another big trend we're going to see is continuing to grow research in terms of privacy techniques, in terms of fairness techniques. How do you think about representation, right? Thinking about, for example, generative models, and thinking about, for example, synthetic media. there's obviously real harms and risks to synthetic media, and we're seeing that already in the conversation in terms of deep fakes. I think there's also going to be a growth of what are the creative as well as representational aspects of generative media. Can you create a data set of images, for example, without having to collect user data from individuals, right? And what does that look like? Is that even possible? And if so, what are the impacts of that type of data? Right. So I think there's going to be interesting growth in a number of different fields, and I think that's really exciting. I think we're at a really open time. But for me, what's really exciting is what are the prospects on the AI ethics side for us to be able to think about this more holistically. One last thing I'll call out that I haven't seen as much of in the industry, but I'm hoping there will be more of, is a conversation about AI outside the United States. Right. I think there are some seminal leaders like in the US and in other countries who are really thinking about what does it mean for AI in different global constructs, right? So how do we think about AI for users in India? What does it mean? What is the context of AI in Africa? What is the context of AI in different European countries, in different South American countries? And I think that's actually going to be really important as well, because right now a lot of our dialogue has been very Western centric. And I think it's going to be really important for us to push that dialogue to better understand the harms, the risks, the opportunities, as we expand in broader contexts.
Yeah, and that is a very important point that you brought about, because the technology is exciting, the opportunities are endless, and a lot of things are there. In fact, I even spoke in one of my interviews that we can actually see Avengers happening for real maybe in the future sometime. But it is also important to understand that going into the future, there will be a lot of other people and a lot of other countries who will have access to this, and it is very important to consider them and then build the whole system around so that we don't have bias. And I think that's a very important conversation. And thank you for bringing that up. Well, this conversation has been great, fantastic insights by you, Tulsee. Before we close this, are there any thoughts that you'd like to share or leave our audience with?
That is a great question. Well, I guess the one thing I would say is no matter what you work on and no matter what project you work on, whether you are someone who focuses on AI ethics and responsible AI, whether you work on AI at all, or whether you're working on just technology broadly, I think this notion of inclusion, ethics, diversity really applies to all of our projects, right? And I think it's really something that we can build in and I think truly shift culture if all of us take our projects and really think about who are the voices in the room, how are we building this, and what are the consequences of what we're building. And so I think this is something that I'm still learning how to do, and I think I'm still learning how to bring in perspectives and make sure that I'm not sticking to my own assumptions and my own unconscious biases. But that's definitely something I would put out as a call to action. I think that if every one of us pushes that a little bit more forward, we're just going to see a huge culture shift in the industry, which I think is really needed.
Absolutely. But there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. Tulsee Doshi with a very beautiful message out there. You have to bring in diversity. And I think we have to think as one whole, as humanity, and not certain parts. And that is a very important conversation going forward, because I think a lot of the conversation has been about possibilities and technology. But what about it? I mean, you can grow it in a way, but what if it goes the other way? And you got to have humans at the center of it, and humans are everywhere, and you have to consider everybody. So that's a very beautiful message put out. And thank you so much, Tulsee, for giving us your time. Your insights were amazing, and I know our audience are really going to enjoy the show.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Appreciate that. And before we log out, to all the audiences, we have a Engati webinar that comes up on 3rd of October. Amazing stuff. You already know how the Engati webinars are. Super fun. Not the boring stuff. A lot of jokes coming in. We're doing it with the amazing Dennis Wakabayashi. It's going to be about live chat and being able to answer complex queries by real time. So all the description links, just check them out. All the registration information will be right there. I'll put all the links for Tulsee's accounts for you guys in the show notes. So reach out to her if you have any doubts. And well, that's about it. And we'll be back with a brand new episode and a brand new expert soon. So stay tuned, and we'll see you around for the next one.